moving on to section C, of course, there are two 25-mark questions here. You pick one, but of course, for practice, we're going to answer both of them. And let's get started with question 7. So going straight to the question, evaluate possible methods of government intervention to control household energy bills. So it sounds like a quite good question so far. So how can the government intervene to control the household energy bills? Now, why do you want to control them? I'm guessing the stimulus is going to tell us. So the average household energy bill rose from 80% from wherever it rose from. So basically, we're trying to. So what's the question asking us now? So let's do a little plan here. So what are the methods that government can intervene to reduce household prices? First one that comes to my mind is, of course, just a maximum price. And why does a maximum price work? It puts a cap on how much these energy firms can charge consumers, thus meaning that, of course, it helps reduce that energy, the household energy bills. But let's keep brainstorming here. So how else can we reduce the household energy bill? And this question is basically, even though it's not specifically stating it, it's kind of just market failure. Like I said, second most popular topic in the A-level economics. It's just strategies to basically solve market failure, but just asking it in a different way. And another great one is subsidies. Why can subsidies help reduce the household energy cost? Because it depends who we subsidise. So in this case, we can actually just subsidise the household. So if the cost is now $3,549, we can maybe subsidise households for 20%. It's like in the UK, single person households, when the energy bill crisis was happening, they would actually get a reduction in the energy bill, which was just a subsidy. Now, there are two great methods, which you pretty much write your entire 25 marker on. So just one paragraph on maximum price, really develop it. One paragraph on subsidies and really develop it. Now, if we want to think of some more points which aren't just generic, we're going to have to take a bit of a deeper dive into what the question is asking us. So it's asking us about the energy market. So if we think about the energy market, you have to use a bit of our own knowledge. How would you say the energy market is structured? Which firms occupy it? What sort of market structure do they occupy? So you can talk about arguments, maybe it's probably, if even without a lot of knowledge on it, you probably can guess it's a bit of an oligopolistic market structure, very high barriers to entry. You could even argue things like if the government had control over the energy market, whether it would be better outcomes for households. So arguments for like privatisation. And so literally you could write a full paragraph on nationalising these energy firms. And if you look at the stimulus, it's told us that energy bills, the prices of energy have risen 80%, but it hasn't actually told us anything about the costs. So that could technically mean that these firms are just making massive super low profits. So then you could talk about how these firms are exploiting consumers, maybe with monopoly power, and they 100% do have monopoly power. So you talk about levels of regulation, so like the CMA coming in. Okay, so personally, the way I do this, probably do one paragraph on maximum price, second paragraph on subsidies, and then if I had time, like I said, a lot of this does depend on timing. I probably would do another paragraph on either one of them two. But if I didn't have enough time, you can still 100% score 25 out of 25 with two solid paragraphs and final judgment. And yeah, but how would I? So let's start with the maximum price diagram. So the way I'd start is, I believe one possible method of government intervention to control household energy prices would be by the government setting a maximum price or a price ceiling. Then, of course, like I always say, what is the paragraph structure? Point, application, analysis, and then link back to question. So then we move on to the application stage of our paragraph. Now this is why in my live classes I emphasize and teach as much real world application as possible, as especially for these 25 mark questions. You need to have an appreciation of the real world of economics, and you will be exposed if you do not know any examples. So here, for example, I would give in 2022 the London Mayor Sadiq Khan proposed to set a maximum price on rent in the UK, in London, to stop the increases in rent prices. There's many examples of this. I think in New York, the mayor Arnold, the actor, he set a maximum price on rent, I think, also, but the one in the UK actually never happened. It was just proposed. But yeah, anyway, it's a good bit of application. And then moving on to the analysis. And the way I'd build most of the chain of analysis is, of course, around the diagram. So how do you draw a maximum price diagram? So price, quantity, what does a maximum price diagram look like? It's just simple supply, demand curve. Now let's think, where is a maximum price diagram? Where's it going to go? Is it above or below the equilibrium price? Now, a maximum price, what you're trying to do, and let's look back to the question, we're trying to reduce that price. We're trying to reduce that price below what the firms are already charging, so below this 3,000. So would a maximum price be above or below the equilibrium? Now, I might explain this every single time we do these, but you don't understand, especially even in high level students, how many students mess this up and then have to redraw it, or they just totally mess up an entire paragraph. But let's think about it. Maximum price, what we're trying to do, we're trying to reduce the price. If you're trying to reduce the price, it's going to be below the equilibrium price. Let me just level up the equilibrium here. So it's going to be below the equilibrium price, thus meaning it's going to look something like this. And we'll call that Pmax. Now this is where you develop the chain of analysis. Let's just label up the diagram. So this is going to be QS, and then this is going to be QD. So what's happening straight away? What does the gap between QS and QD represent? This represents what? It represents excess demand. Why is that? Let's think very simply. Prices have decreased from PE to Pmax, thus producers have less incentive to supply. But then if you think about the inverse relationship of demand, it means that at lower prices, there's more quantity demanded. So these lower prices, consumers want more, but producers do not want to produce as much at these lower prices. Now, it depends on the sector, but in this question, we're talking about energy, and of course, energy is a necessity. It's a massive thing that consumers need, so it's going to be a massive problem for consumers if they cannot get energy and if there's an excess demand of energy. But that's more of a negative effect of it, and you probably would use that in evaluation. So the way I would basically structure my analysis, just tell the examiner basically what I've said to you so far, that they would set the maximum price at the price ceiling below the equilibrium price, as they want to reduce that, and even use a bit of application here. They want to reduce the price from 3,549 to a price that's more affordable for consumers. Why does that work? Since, like I said, talk about the inverse relationship of demand at lower prices, consumers can afford to demand more. And let's think about the surpluses. If prices decrease below the equilibrium, what is going to happen to consumer surplus? Of course, consumer surplus is going to increase. And you can't actually show this on the diagram. This is not needed, but since the problem with the maximum price diagram is that it's a very simple, very straightforward diagram. So adding a few of these annotations can just elevate that level and show you that top level, that level 5 band student. So all you need to do is go from your Pmax, so at that point where your Pmax intersects the supply curve, and go vertically up from there. And then from there, once you've hit this point here, go left. Now this should mean you have 3 triangles, so 1 triangle here, 1 triangle here, and 1 triangle here, then 2 boxes. So 3 triangles are 2 boxes by basically just going from your where supply equals your Pmax, go up and then go left. Now, what do these represent? Very simply, all these 3 are just consumer surplus, and this last one is specifically consumer surplus gain. So this is the consumer surplus gained by setting a maximum price. Why? Of course, since the price decreases, so there's more consumers who are willing and able to buy. And then also we have this triangle here, which is a complete triangle of deadweight loss. And you can be even more specific with it. The top of the triangle is consumer deadweight welfare loss, and the bottom of the triangle is producer deadweight welfare loss. And of course, the reason why the producer deadweight welfare loss happens is since a lower price, so there's less producers who are willing and able to produce at that price. But that last triangle below there will actually show the producer surplus. So even though the price is low, there's still some consumers, there's still some gap between what consumers are willing to produce for and what they actually produce for. But overall, all this does is just helps you add a few more analysis points where you talk about how the effects of the maximum price. The maximum price, of course, is going to lead to consumer surplus gain, producer surplus loss, and then, of course, deadweight loss. And you can talk about the specific deadweight losses. And overall, relate this back to the question, would help reduce the household energy prices, help maybe make this figure a bit closer to the original figure, etc, etc. And then, of course, in your 25 marker, you will be expected to have a very high level of evaluation. And how are you going to evaluate this? Now, there are plenty of evaluation points here. I would aim for 2 to 3 here, 100%, since there's so many quality evaluation points. Number one, firstly, you can comment on the excess demand, like I said previously. Since it's like I said, it's a necessity good. There's excess demand, so basically there's not enough supply of a necessity good. That's going to lead to very bad consumer outcomes. So the way I'd phrase it is probably, however, this depends on the shortage caused by maximum prices, and that is actually going to lead to a worse outcome for society overall. And then quote it, use your diagram, show the examiner, pick up those application marks, pick up those diagram marks, show the examiner exactly where that excess demand is, so from QS to QD, and tell me what that means. Now, another great evaluation point that should basically, you can use it in taxes, you can use it in maximum prices, and you've probably heard me say it before, but however, this depends on the size of the maximum price. As if we have a look at this, and just a little quick example, if you really wanted to, if you had the time, you could even draw out this example. If we set the maximum price somewhere like here, look how much that amplifies the losses on the diagram. Look how much, if you just look at the producer surplus, look how much smaller the producer surplus is. Look how much larger the excess demand is, for example, and this is going to lead to severe shortages. And so you could say, however, in evaluation, the positive effects or the effectiveness of the maximum price depends on the size of the maximum price. As when the government sets the maximum price, they do not have perfect information. Therefore, if they set the maximum price at a too large value, so if they set the maximum price, the price ceiling too low, it's going to lead to catastrophic, like massive effects on excess demand, massive shortages, massive reductions in producer surplus, thus leading to a much worse allocation of resources. And you can link that to a main thing, which is government failure, where the government have intervened in the market and led to a worsened allocation of resources than before. Now, another great evaluation point is the presence of black markets. So usually we say that by setting maximum prices for most goods, it's going to lead to black markets. And of course, you could just talk about classic ones like the admin costs of regulation, as they're going to have to spend tax money, allocate resources to like enforcers who make sure these energy firms are charging that maximum price and not charging any higher. So you can talk about the opportunity cost of allocating those resources there, whereas you could probably spend those resources on, I don't know, investing into new renewable energy sources, which in the long run could become cheaper. But yeah, like I always say, lots of points for that paragraph, but that is a brief summary on how I would do the maximum price diagram on, well, the maximum price paragraph. And then let's move on to the second paragraph, which of course would be the subsidies paragraph. Now, moving on to the second paragraph, and it depends, like I said, you can do a paragraph of maximum prices, one on nationalisation, one on CMA regulation. But if you were doing the subsidies paragraph, like I said, you might pick subsidies and you might pick nationalisation. So you might only do them two paragraphs, since maximum price and subsidies, a lot of the time you're going to be speaking about very similar things. As if you just think about it, subsidies, how are we going to word the question? One possible method the government can intervene to control household energy bills is providing households with subsidies. E.g, the UK provided single-person households in 2023 with a household bill subsidy. And then move on to basically the diagram and the chains of analysis. How would you do this? Of course, you draw a subsidy diagram, which looks something like this. So supply, and then S plus sub, and then the demand curve. Now, with the subsidy diagram, like I said, it's a very almost like year 12 diagram. It's a very simple diagram where there's not much you can really speak about unless you annotate it and you add in the points, which is pretty much like we did before, just commenting on the consumer and producer surplus and commenting on how they change. And yeah, and the way I do that is just labeling this up. So A there, B, C, then D, E. As remember one thing, when I'm illustrating diagrams on the iPad, I'm usually just colouring them in, but your exam paper is going to scan in black and white, so it doesn't matter if you use colours in your exam, everything scans in black and white. So if you've just got diagrams like this, where consumer surplus before, consumer surplus after, all the examiner is going to see is black diagrams, and of course that makes it a lot less easy for the examiner to actually identify what you're saying, as how does the examiner know what's the differentiation between them two? So what I would do is, the way I would do it is consumer surplus before, and then consumer surplus after. So what is consumer surplus before? It's of course A, B, P, E, so just that triangle there. And then what is consumer surplus after? So after the subsidy. So of course, what does subsidy do? It it reduces producers' cost of production, thus shifting the supply curve out to S plus sub, which leads to lower prices for consumers and higher quantity produced. But what is consumer surplus after? It is now this larger triangle, which is A, P1, D. And let's do the same for producer surplus. So what is producer surplus before? So before supply curve, so the original supply curve is this little triangle here, which is PEBC, and then producer surplus after. So once this is our new supply curve, our S plus sub is P1, D, E. So this triangle here now. So basically we go from here to here with producer surplus, and then we go here to here with consumer surplus. And then with regards to evaluation, just the classic evaluation points like opportunity cost of subsidy. Like I said before, they can maybe allocate these resources because they talk about energy firms. Instead of subsidising households, they could subsidise eco-friendly energy, thus meaning that they no longer have to rely on these like fossil fuels. Always subsidies, the valuation points are always quite simple. One of them is always going to be opportunity cost. And the way you could word this is saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether providing subsidies to households is the best way for the government to control household energy bills, as the government could allocate these resources to the process of nationalisation, so changing these energy firms from the private sector to owned by the state, meaning that it would have better long-run effects or impacts on consumers, as it means that by firms, and then you could just basically mention the positive effects of if the energy sector was nationalised, like something like they would buy all the energy, so they could they have more bulk buying power, and then of course, since they're government, they want to be actively efficient. They want to provide benefit to society. They could maybe even take a bit of a loss, so the society could benefit. And the way you could word that, it all depends on your paragraph. If your third paragraph is not nationalisation, maybe it's more to do with CMA regulation. You could word it saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether subsidies to households are the most effective way for the government to control household energy bills, as the government could allocate these resources, allocate the funds from the subsidy to spend on the process of nationalisation, as if the energy sector is nationalised, it would lead to several benefits for consumers, as the state would own the entire energy sector, therefore would experience the benefits of lower prices. So wherever they buy the energy from, they would have lower costs, thus meaning that could be translated to consumers. And things like a nationalised firm is going to be actively efficient. It's trying to provide positive externalities. It's trying to provide society with benefits. Therefore, it could lead to better overall outcomes for society. And that is the way, such a simple evaluation point being opportunity cost, you can really transform it into an A-star evaluation point. And what I always try to do with evaluation, even though the stimulus is small, like I always do with my section B evaluation, I'm always trying to relate it to the extract. But here also, you could talk about, however, in evaluation, this depends on the long run, on the longevity of the subsidy, as the government don't know what's going to happen to household energy bill prices in the long run. So they might continue rising. They may become 30,000 in 5 years. No one knows what's going to happen. Therefore, it depends on the sustainability, whether the government can actually continue subsidising every single household in the UK. So it depends on the long run effects of energy bills and energy prices. But yeah, of course, lots of evaluation points there, just a brief overview, brief summary of how I would attempt a paragraph on maximum prices and how I would attempt a paragraph on subsidy. Moving on to the second 25 mark question, let's have a read of this. So evaluate possible methods, so it's asking about methods of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions caused by road transport in the UK. Now, for those of you who have done lots of past papers, who have done lots of essays, this question is very similar to previous questions. And what does this question link to? This question links a lot to previous questions, and it's very similar to previous questions on market failure / like government failure. So that type of topic area, so market failure, government intervention. Of course, it mentions government intervention in the question, but it's basically asking you, essentially, all the question is policies to solve market failure. And they are very easy, and of course we've learned lots of them. And if you break the question down in smaller chunks, it's talking about carbon emissions, road transport in the UK, and all of these cause negative externalities. So definitely for one of the paragraphs, I would probably write about tax, and then maybe throw in a negative externality diagram, mention a bit of market failure theory in as well, since it's definitely relevant. But just in general, with 25 marker technique, a classic thing students ask me is they'll read a question and their mind will go blank. How do you solve that? Lots of students will literally have the A-star content knowledge where they'll know everything, but still their mind will go blank. And this is why, of course, I always say economics is a double-edged sword. You need your content knowledge to be, you need mastery of content knowledge, but also you need mastery of exam technique to get that A and A-star. But, so you're reading the 25 marker, you go blank. What do? The main thing you need to do is try link it to a topic area. So link it to the big topics in economics you've learned. Try link it to maybe market failure, market structure, so like monopolies, labour markets, whatever it links to, just try link it to a big topic area. Then once you've managed to link it to a topic area, then you can go about thinking about maybe your notes in that topic area, maybe some revision you've done in that topic area, and slowly ideas should pop in your mind. But definitely with the exam pressure and on exam day, you should actually be expecting that when you read some questions, your mind should go blank. You need to prepare for the worst basically, and if it does happen, just use that strategy, link it to topic areas, and slowly the ideas will come flooding in, and then you can go about writing. Okay, so like I said, this is an absolute classic question, and let's just try plan some of the points we can mention. So number one, 100%, if we're talking about trying to reduce the carbon emissions, what is the main strategy you kind of learn with policies to reduce something, maybe reduce consumption, maybe reduce production of something. And the main policy, the first policy that should pop into your mind from your content knowledge is an indirect or just a tax. So you're probably going to do a tax on producers, maybe when producers sell the car or when producers produce new diesel or petrol cars, since of course there is the diesel and petrol cars which do release emissions. And what is a tax trying to do? We're trying to incentivize these producers to stop producing petrol and diesel cars and move towards maybe electric car production, since electric cars are better for carbon emissions. But of course that is an evaluation in itself. Of course, electric vehicles, the batteries, they have massive carbon footprints, like absolute massive carbon footprints, and that works as a really good evaluation point, saying that we're trying to incentivize the production of electric vehicles, but it depends on whether electric vehicles are actually that much more sustainable, that much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than petrol and diesel vehicles. So let's try to just plan some of the policies we would use. So what is the first policy in the main paragraph I believe you should write? So essentially the question is asking us, how can the government reduce the production of carbon emissions? So one of the ways we're going to do that is reduce the production of cars. What is a big way we can do that? Using prices. And your big first paragraph should be taxes, and if you want to be more specific, an indirect tax. Why? How could we use this? Since to reduce carbon emissions, we probably the best case scenario. We haven't actually read the stimulus yet, so this mentioned, what did this actually mention? A petrol car journey from London to Glasgow is 3.3 times more carbon dioxide than by train. But anyway. So if we're indirect taxing, what we're going to do, we're probably going to tax the production of diesel and petrol cars. Why? So what is a tax going to do? If we tax the producers, it's going to increase the cost of production of these diesel and petrol cars. And why will that help reduce carbon emissions? You could say it incentivizes people to buy electric cars, since if diesel and petrol cars are more expensive now, of course electric cars is a substitute. Individuals may substitute away from diesel and petrol cars to electric cars, or producers may just simply stop producing petrol and diesel cars since they're too expensive and just stop producing electric cars. But a great thing to mention with electric cars, and this is just real world application, electric cars themselves, although I think they don't release carbon or carbon dioxide, but they have a massive carbon footprint. They were in the process of making the battery, transporting these massive electrical batteries. They have a massive carbon footprint. So you can also mention the effectiveness of whether we're actually reaching our goal. So our goal is to reduce carbon emissions, but are electric vehicles actually that much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than petrol and diesel vehicles, since the carbon footprint is so large? And this is just all real world application. It's just like reading the news. I wouldn't particularly suggest students to read the news, since there's a lot of waffle that you won't remember, but just making sure, especially I emphasize it in live classes, make sure if your teacher's teaching, he's including as much application as is just necessary, and it works really well for evaluation. So what would I mention in my tax paragraph? So the first thing and the big thing, and the main thing that's going to drive my chain of analysis, assist me in the chain of analysis, and this is how you need to think of diagrams. If you can use a diagram, it is perfect. Why? Because it just helps you. A lot of students struggle with the length of the chain of analysis, making the chain of analysis step by step. But if you can include a diagram, it makes it, I'd say, like 50% easier. But then it's about having that diagram mastery. This is where in your revision, you need to really strive to understand what the diagram means. You should know every little bit of the diagram. So, for example, in this, we're going to draw a negative externality diagram. So supply equals MPC. You shouldn't just learn the diagram just knowing that it's the supply equals MPC. You should know what marginal private cost actually means and the backstory almost behind it. And that, just learning, if you just want to do it for the main diagrams, just learning what these things actually mean is going to boost your grade, and it's going to make that chain of analysis move from a simple band 2, band 3 chain of analysis to that top level band 4 and band 5 chains of analysis. But yeah, so we're just going to draw a negative production externality diagram. So like I said, supply equals marginal private cost. I have not actually labeled my axis. Demand equals marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit. And obviously cost slash benefit on this axis, quantity on this axis, and then we have marginal social cost curve, which is obviously above our marginal private cost curve. And how would we show a tax on this diagram? You can do it very simply by just putting a comma there and putting MPC plus tax, since this is of course the perfect size for the tax. Why? Because now the producers are operating at a socially efficient equilibrium. Let's label that on. So what would this equilibrium be? This would of course be the market equilibrium at QE, and then we have where MSC intersects MSB. This is now the socially efficient equilibrium at this point, which is just to label on. That is a socially efficient equilibrium, and the blue point is the market equilibrium. Last few things to label on, just label on the triangle of welfare loss. Of course, how do we work that out? We go from a market equilibrium where supply equals demand, so this blue point here, and you go up or down to the social curve, and the social curve is up in this scenario, so you would just go straight up, and that is your welfare loss. And other thing to label is just the bottom of the diagram, just the difference in QSE and QE is the overproduction. Okay, so how would I actually now use this diagram in my chain of analysis? So let's go about it. So of course, simple normal paragraph structure, A-star paragraph structure video, very good one. Go and watch it if you haven't. But what is the paragraph structure? It's point, application, analysis, link back to question. So it's basically KA paragraph structure, and then at the end you link back to the question. But so I would say one method of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions caused by road transport in the UK. You should be picking up here. What am I doing? I'm reusing literally every single word from the question. One thing examiners will say in examiners' reports, or just say on students' scripts, is that they're not directly answering the question. How do you solve that? You literally use the exact wording from the question and address the question directly, so you can never get that mark or never get marked down for that reason. So one method of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions is by the government setting an indirect tax on producers. Then I would move on to application, saying something like, in the UK, there is a 52 pence per litre of petrol or diesel tax. And that is literally how simple real world application is. You just need to mention a stat is always the best. And I really do try to go through as many of these as possible in my live classes, because it's so important, and you can almost build like a little fact file of just these stats when I go through them. But so 52 pence per litre is tax, and then I would move on to my chains of analysis. So this part of my paragraph. So then I would probably start by just mentioning that producers before the tax, they start at the market equilibrium. Of course, at the market equilibrium, we are producing at QE. Why is that? Since in the free market, producers only think about their private costs and not external costs. Thus, they overproduce. So they produce at quantity QE, which is of course not at the socially efficient production quantity. Therefore, the government have to intervene. They have to set a tax. So they intervene with MPC plus tax. What does that lead to? It means that by setting a tax, by increasing the producer's private cost of production, it means the overproduction is no longer happening. We are producing at QSE instead of QE. And since there's no longer any overproduction, it means the welfare loss to society, the deadweight loss to society, is no longer happening. As then you can talk about prices. As prices increase from PE to P1, or the cost to producers increase to PE to P1, this could mean these producers could relay these costs onto consumers, so that they could pass these costs onto consumers. Thus, of course, like we were saying, if there's higher costs of petrol and diesel cars, it will incentivize consumers to find other avenues, such as electric vehicles or even public transport. So instead of taking a car to work, they might start taking a train to work. And then you can link in this part of the stimulus, saying that E.G. trains are 3.3 times less carbon emissions than a car. So yeah, basically just explaining the diagram a bit, then explaining why the tax works. The tax, you just explain that incentivizes individuals to find other methods of transport, thus reducing the number of admissions, or the quantity of admissions, and that overall achieves the government's goal of reducing carbon emissions. So just that last bit there, mentioning thus overall reaching the government's goal of reducing carbon emissions, that is there. That is linking back to the question. The reason why I suggest students do this, one of the biggest problems students have year on year, I've seen it with experience, is students waffle. They start going on tangents, speaking about random things. But always, if you're writing your chain of analysis, and in the back of your mind, if you're always you're always thinking about, okay, I need to eventually link this back to the question, it will stop you going off track, and it'll keep you focused on the question. Since remember, you can write the best economics theory, if it's not to do with the question, you won't be picking up any marks. Okay, so moving on to the 9 marks of evaluation you have in your 25 mark question. I am going to go through it quite briefly. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to go through evaluation a bit more in depth, since I feel like well, of course, for me, evaluation is quite simple because I've been teaching this for how many years. But let me know, since a lot of students struggle with evaluation. So if I do get a few comments, I will start making the evaluation a bit more in detail to help you guys out. But how would I evaluate this? So like I said before, what we mentioned, the first point, is just the carbon footprint of electric cars is, of course, absolutely massive. So that means that you can link that to government failure. Why is that government failure? The government have intervened in the market to try and reduce the carbon emissions. However, in reality, it's not a great policy, is it? Since if because we're trying to incentivize electric vehicles, but if electric vehicles also have a massive carbon footprint, have massive carbon emissions, it's an example of government failure. Why? Because the government have intervened in the market to try improve the allocation of resources, so improve the carbon emissions, but in reality, they haven't particularly solved it. They haven't internalized the negative externality, you can say. And then of course, just the size of the tax. You can say the government does not have perfect information on the market. They may set the tax. Okay, so that is the indirect tax paragraph done, but for this question there are absolutely loads of possibilities and different ways you can answer the question. So let's try to think of some more. So basically, methods of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions. So other ones include, so I'm just going to write policies. Other ones include, of course, subsidies. So whatever way you want to subsidise. Maybe you want to subsidise new electric vehicles. Maybe even you want to subsidise public transport. So whatever you want to subsidise, since if you subsidise public transport, again, due to the inverse relationship of demand, when prices fall, quantity demanded increases. Why? Because it incentivises producers to substitute away, since public transport, electric vehicles, petrol, diesel vehicles, so fueled power vehicles, they are all substitutes of each other. So yeah, subsidies is definitely one. I'm not going to go into depth with the paragraph on subsidies, since literally in the last question we just covered the entire chain of analysis for subsidies. I will just do the same thing. Consumer producer surplus, make sure you include it on the subsidy diagram, as it just elevates this from a normal year 12 diagram to a really top level year 13A star diagram. And of course, just as very brief, subsidy, what does it do? Shift the supply curve out to S plus sub, increases quantity produced and decreases the price. Then you'd mention how there's an increase in consumer and producer surplus, and yeah, just go from there. And evaluations, of course, it depends whether producers respond to the subsidy, opportunity cost of subsidy, and a few more. Okay, another great policy we can use for this question is deregulation. What does deregulation mean? Deregulation, of course, in this scenario would mean in the car industry, we reduce legislation, we basically make it easier, we reduce the barriers to entry to enter the car industry market, so the production of cars. Why would this help our goal of reducing carbon emissions? As if you reduce that regulation, it's going to lead to, if you reduce the barriers to entry, it's going to be easier for new entrants, new firms to enter the market. This will therefore increase competition in the market. And when there's more competition in the market, there's more firms in the market, it can definitely lead to innovation. It can lead to the incumbent firms being forced to innovate to maintain their market share, or the new firms just coming in and changing up the market, bringing a new taste to the market. But by new firms coming into the market, it can lead to investment into these electric cars, into these electric vehicles, thus meaning it's a double positive for the government. Why? Firstly, with something like subsidies, of course, it's going to cost the government to intervene. Something like taxes is still admin costs for the government to intervene, and it can lead to government failure, since the government is intervening in the market itself. Whereas, if we think about deregulation, we can class this as a market-based supply-side policy. Since why? Since with deregulation, the government is actually decreasing their intervention in the market. So they have less control of the market. So therefore it reduces the likelihood of government failure occurring, since they are actually, instead of increasing their intervention in the market, they're decreasing their intervention in the market. And with regards to evaluation of deregulation, a great evaluation and a complete polar opposite would of course be just regulation. So however, in evaluation, this depends on whether regulation by, for example, the CMA would be a more effective policy. As maybe the CMA could regulate these car industry producers to stop overcharging maybe for the electric vehicles, or it could regulate public transport. Maybe the trams, the trains, the buses are overcharging consumers. So therefore regulation may actually be a better policy than deregulation. So it's almost in evaluation there, you're almost weighing up your argument. And it's really good, since in these policy questions, since we're presenting a policy, a great evaluation is actually just presenting another policy that works on the negatives of the policy you presented, that improves on the negatives of the policy you presented. Also, since the majority of the UK population, it's very likely that you watching this are from London. London, of course, have ULEZ, so that is a good bit of application you can include whenever you're thinking about carbon emissions, anything to do with cars. And then some more policies, like, of course, you can do the classic ones, min plus maximum prices. They would, of course, work well here. And like I always say, if you're drawing these diagrams, don't just keep them the simple classic diagram like this. add in the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the where the deadweight welfare loss is, as it just upgrades that diagram, gives you a bit more to speak about in that chain of analysis, thus allowing you to reach those higher levels. And with regards to valuation, I've actually been mentioning quite a lot that they're all substitutes. That public transport, cars, petrol cars, electric cars are all substitutes. But you could 100%, whenever we talk about substitutes, you could discuss the value of the XCD, whether they are strong substitutes or whether they are weaker substitutes. Then, of course, another valuation is time frame. Also, petrol, diesel, it's not a renewable source. So instead of the government intervening, maybe the market itself, and this is a really good evaluation, the market itself maybe is able to solve the market failure. Why? Since petrol and diesel, they're running out the non-renewable resources, and this will force the market to innovate. It will force producers to stop allocating more resources towards electric vehicles. Therefore, in the long run, the government does not actually have to intervene, since the market itself will solve the failure of using petrol and diesel cars. But yeah, like you can probably tell, and I've only mentioned probably 40% of the points, there are an absolute abundance of points here. But again, do not try to get too overwhelmed with the variety of points. Pick your points, whether it's tax, subsidies. If that's your 2 paragraphs, focus on them. In your final judgment, you can throw in things like deregulation, maximum minimum prices, but focus on your points. Of course, step-by-step chain analysis, break everything down, and yeah, that should be more than enough. And this is a really, really good question. And if you get something like this in your exam, you should be chuffed, because this is a very nice one. And you can 100%, if you've done your practice, score 20 plus, score anywhere around 25 on this. Okay, so what are the main takeaways from this paper? Firstly, just like your content knowledge needs to be solid. Of course, that is quite general advice, but for example, I believe we got, if I remember correctly, you did get examined on things like XCD here. That is it's quite niche, to be honest, but just make sure for your section A especially, make sure you've got those bits revised. And then, if I do this every time, I can say this every single time, make sure you're solid on your application. It's just it's a cornerstone of your grade, and you need to make sure you are learning it somehow. And a really good way, join the live classes. We do teach a heck of a lot of application. But yeah, that is 2023 paper 1 done.